Stay right there. Don't touch that stick. We got a call about a guy brandishing a weapon at this stop. That you?
Officer, please, I'm blind. This is a mobility cane. I'm just waiting for the number 7 bus to go home.
I don't care what you call it. Looks like a club to me. And you're looking right at me. Stop faking the disability and stand up.
I am following the sound of your voice. I need that cane to find the curb so I don't walk.
Officer Brian Matthew. Stay right there. Got a call about a suspicious male, possibly armed. Drop that stick and put your hands on the bench. Trent Walker. Officer, you're mistaken. I'm blind. This is a white cane for navigation. Officer Brian Matthew. Looks like a weapon to me. And you looked right at me when I spoke. Trent Walker. I'm blind, not deaf. I can hear exactly where you're standing. Officer Brian Matthew. Badge number 5823 of the Riverside Police Department. Saw a black man with protective eyewear and a white mobility cane, and immediately assumed armed suspect instead of blind citizen. He didn't realize he was confronting Trent Walker. Turner, a lifelong Riverside resident who had been blind since childhood and was widely recognized throughout the community as a disability rights leader. In an aggressive display of willful ignorance, Matthew ripped Trent Walker's only means of safe navigation from his hands, snatched his protective glasses, arrested him for possession of a weapon and providing false information, and shoved a helpless man into a patrol car while he stumbled blindly without his cane. What Matthew didn't know was that security cameras and witness smartphones captured his entire career-ending mistake in crystal clear HD, and that his assumption that a black man was faking blindness would cost him his badge and result in a devastating $9.2 million federal judgment. Before we dive into this shocking story of injustice and accountability, we need to know where you're watching from. Drop your city or country in the comments right now. We love seeing our community spread across the globe. And if you believe that disability rights are human rights and that no one should be arrested for simply existing in public, make sure you hit that like button and subscribe. This story will make you angry, but it will also show you why speaking up and recording matters. Let's get into it. The alarm went off at 5:47 a.m., 3 minutes before Trent Walker. Turner needed it to. He was already awake, listening to the rhythm of his neighborhood coming to life. The garbage truck 2 blocks over, grinding its way down Morrison Street. Mrs. Chen's door closed as she left for her bakery shift. The sprinklers at Riverside Park, clicking on with their familiar hiss and sputter. This was Trent Walker's morning symphony, and he knew every instrument. He swung his legs out of bed, and his feet found the slippers exactly where they always were, positioned at a 45-degree angle from the nightstand. Muscle memory guided him through his apartment, a modest 2-bedroom on the 3rd floor of a building he'd lived in for 23 years. The microwave was 12 steps from his bedroom door. The coffee maker sat on the counter's left side, positioned so the handle faced outward at 10 o'clock. He'd arranged his entire world into a geography of sound, texture, and precise repetition. While the coffee brewed, Trent Walker ran his fingers across the Braille calendar on his refrigerator. Tuesday, February 9th. City Council meeting at 2 o'clock. He had a presentation prepared about accessible crosswalk signals at the new downtown development, a project he'd been fighting for as Riverside's disability rights coordinator for the past 8 years. The developers didn't want to spend the extra money on audible signals. They thought flashing lights were enough. They didn't understand that for someone like Trent Walker, a busy intersection without sound cues was a death trap disguised as progress. His coffee finished brewing with 3 distinct beeps. Trent Walker poured it into his travel mug, feeling the heat rise against his palm as the liquid reached the indent he'd marked at 3/4 full. He never spilled. Spilling meant losing control. And control was everything when the world was determined to tell you that you couldn't manage your own life. The radio clicked on at 6:15, right on schedule. Trent Walker listened to the morning news while he dressed, buttoning his shirt by counting the holes, knotting his tie using the technique his father had taught him when he was 12, back when he could still see shadows and light. A car accident had stolen his sight at age 7, but his father had refused to let it steal his independence. Blindness is a characteristic, not a disability, his father used to say. It's the world that's disabled when it can't accommodate you. Trent Walker had built his career on that philosophy. He'd fought through architecture school when professors said a blind man couldn't design buildings. He'd proven them wrong by creating tactile models and learning CAD software with screen readers. He'd become Riverside's senior urban planner by age 35, the youngest person ever appointed to the position. He'd spent the last 15 years making his city more accessible, one curb cut and ramp and audible signal at a time. By 7:30, Trent Walker was ready. He checked his bag one more time, running his hands over the contents. Laptop, charging cable, presentation notes in Braille, business cards in the front pocket. His white cane was waiting by the door where he always left it, the red reflective band at the bottom identifying it as belonging to someone who was totally blind, not just visually impaired. The cane was graphite fiber, lightweight and collapsible, custom-fitted to his height. He'd had it for 3 years. It was like an extension of his arm. The walk to the bus stop took exactly 8 minutes. Trent Walker's cane swept in front of him in smooth arcs, tapping the sidewalk in a rhythm that had become as natural as breathing. Tap, tap, step, tap, tap, step. He knew every crack in the pavement, every dip where the tree roots had buckled the concrete. He knew the bus stop bench sat 16 steps past the crosswalk, positioned under an aluminum shelter that pinged distinctly when rain hit it. He arrived at 7:38, 2 minutes before the scheduled pickup. The bench was empty. Trent Walker sat on the left side, positioning his cane between his knees, his hand resting on the curved handle. Morning traffic hummed past, each vehicle creating its own acoustic signature. The hybrid sedan with the quiet engine, the diesel truck with the deep rumble, the motorcycle that needed a new muffler. Other commuters began to arrive, their footsteps announcing them before they spoke. "Morning, Trent Walker," said Marcus, who worked at the hardware store downtown. "Are you ready to give those council members hell today?" Trent Walker smiled. "Always ready." A few moments later, he heard Teresa's heels clicking against the sidewalk. She worked in the same municipal building, 2 floors above him in the permits department. "I heard you're presenting today," she said. "Give them the data about accident rates. Numbers don't lie." Trent Walker appreciated the way his regular bus stop companions treated him. No one grabbed his arm without asking. No one shouted at him, as if blindness affected hearing. They understood that he was simply a man waiting for a bus, just like them, navigating the world with different tools. He'd worked hard to build that understanding, giving talks at schools and community centers, serving on boards and committees, making himself visible so that other blind people in Riverside wouldn't have to fight the same battles he'd already won. The bus was due in 4 minutes. Trent Walker could hear it in the distance, the distinctive air brake system that marked the Route 12 Express. He stood, positioning himself at the curb, cane in his right hand. The morning sun was warming his face. He couldn't see it, but he could feel it, and for a moment, everything was exactly as it should be. Then he heard the car door slam. Heavy boots on pavement, footsteps approaching fast, too fast, with none of the casual rhythm of someone just passing by, and a voice, sharp with authority and suspicion, cutting through the morning quiet like a blade. "Stay right there." Officer Brian Matthew had been in the Riverside Police Department for 11 years, and in those 11 years, he'd filed more use-of-force reports than any other officer in his precinct. His personnel file was thick, with citizen complaints, internal investigations, and mandatory retraining sessions that never seemed to change anything. He'd been suspended twice, reprimanded 4 times, and reassigned to different shifts and districts 6 times. And yet, somehow, he was still on the street, still wearing the badge, still convinced that everyone who looked at him wrong was a threat that needed to be neutralized. Matthew's colleagues called him Hammer behind his back, because when you're a hammer, everything looks like a nail. He'd pepper-sprayed a teenager for filming him during a traffic stop. He'd tased a homeless man who was sleeping in a doorway because Matthew thought his outstretched hand could have been reaching for a weapon. He'd dragged a woman out of her car by her hair during a routine speeding violation because she'd asked to see his supervisor. Each time, the department conducted an investigation. Each time, Matthew wrote a report claiming he'd feared for his safety. Each time, the union backed him up. And each time, after a brief suspension and a stern talking to, Matthew went right back to patrolling the streets with the same aggressive paranoia that had gotten him in trouble in the first place. The problem, as his second ex-wife had tried to explain before she left, was that Matthew saw the world in binaries. Cop or criminal, threat or non-threat, comply or resist. There was no middle ground in his mind, no room for nuance or context, or the possibility that someone might be scared or confused rather than defiant. He'd grown up watching his father, a state trooper, come home with stories about the animals on the street who needed to be put in their place. He'd absorbed the lesson that authority was something you took, not something you earned, and that respect meant fear. By the time Matthew joined Riverside PD at age 24, he already had the mindset of a warrior in enemy territory. The department's training had only reinforced it. They taught him about the, quote, 21-foot rule, the distance within which a suspect with a knife could close the gap and kill an officer before he could draw his weapon. They showed him videos of officers being ambushed during routine stops. They drilled into him that hesitation could be fatal, that the first priority was always to go home at the end of your shift, no matter what you had to do to make that happen. What they didn't teach him was how to de-escalate, how to listen, how to recognize that not every interaction needed to be a confrontation. Matthew had never learned those skills, and at this point in his career, he wasn't interested in learning them. He decided long ago that the world was divided into sheep and wolves, and if you weren't a wolf, you were prey. This morning, Matthew was in a particularly foul mood. He'd gotten into an argument with his girlfriend about money, about his gambling debts, about the fact that he'd spent half his paycheck at the casino again when they were already 2 months behind on rent. She'd screamed at him that he had a problem, that he needed help, and he'd responded by punching a hole in the kitchen wall and storming out. Now he was cruising through downtown Riverside at 7:30 a.m., looking for something, anything, to take his frustration out on. The call came in at 7:36. Suspicious male at the bus stop on Riverside and 5th. Caller reports possible weapon. The dispatcher's voice was routine, almost bored. These calls came in constantly, usually from paranoid residents who thought anyone they didn't recognize was automatically a criminal. 99 times out of 100, it was nothing, but Matthew's pulse quickened anyway. This was what he lived for. The possibility of action, the justification for the aggression that was always simmering just below his surface. He flipped on his lights and accelerated toward the location, his hand already resting on his service weapon. In his mind, he was already rehearsing the encounter. Approach with authority. Establish dominance. Don't give them time to think. If they resisted, that was their choice. If they got hurt, that was their fault. Matthew had learned that if you wrote the report the right way, you could justify almost anything. Fear for your safety was a magic phrase that turned assault into acceptable use of force. As he pulled up to the bus stop, Matthew scanned the small crowd of waiting commuters. His eyes locked onto a black man in his late 20s, wearing dark sunglasses and a navy hoodie, standing at the curb with what looked like a metal rod in his hand. Matthew's training kicked in immediately. Dark glasses meant concealed identity. Hoodie meant potential concealment of weapons or contraband. The metal rod was obviously some kind of bludgeon, maybe a tire iron or a collapsible baton. And the way the man was standing there, so casual, so unconcerned, that was the behavior of someone who thought he could get away with something. Matthew didn't notice the red and white bands on the cane. He didn't notice that the man's gaze was unfocused, directed at nothing in particular. He didn't notice the other commuters greeting the man by name, treating him like a familiar neighbor. All Matthew saw was a suspect matching a description, and all he felt was the familiar rush of adrenaline that came with the hunt. He stepped out of his patrol car and unsnapped his holster, not drawing his weapon yet but making sure everyone could see his hand resting on it. His voice came out hard and loud, the voice he used when he wanted people to know he was in charge. "Stay right there. Got a call about a suspicious male, possibly armed. Drop that stick and put your hands on the bench." The man turned toward the sound of Matthew's voice, but his eyes didn't quite focus on Matthew's face. For a split second, something nagged at the edge of Matthew's consciousness, a detail that didn't fit the pattern. But he pushed it aside. He'd learned to trust his gut, and his gut was telling him this was a threat. Everything else was just noise. Trent Walker. Turner felt his entire body go rigid the moment the officer's command cut through the morning air. He'd been a black man in America for 28 years. He knew that tone. He knew what it meant when an officer approached with aggression already loaded in his voice, with assumptions already hardened into certainty. He'd given talks about this exact scenario at police academies, explaining to officers how to recognize mobility aids, how to interact with disabled citizens, and how a moment of observation could prevent a catastrophic mistake. Apparently, this officer had missed those training sessions. "Officer, you're mistaken," Trent Walker said, keeping his voice calm and steady despite the fear coiling in his chest. "I'm blind. This is a white cane for navigation." He lifted the cane slightly, angling it so the officer could see the red reflective band at the bottom, the internationally recognized symbol that identified its user as someone with total blindness. His other hand remained visible, palm open, fingers spread. Non-threatening. Compliant. All the things he'd been taught since childhood that a black man needed to be when police were involved. Looks like a weapon to me," Matthew said, taking a step closer. His hand was still on his gun. Trent Walker could hear the leather of the holster creaking as Matthew's fingers tightened around the grip. "And you looked right at me when I spoke." The accusation hung in the air like poison. Trent Walker had heard it before. This suspicion that blind people were faking, that if you turned your head toward a sound you must be able to see. It was born from ignorance, from people who didn't understand that human beings orient themselves toward voices automatically, that echolocation and spatial awareness didn't require sight. But explaining that to an officer who'd already decided you were lying felt like trying to reason with an avalanche. "I'm blind, not deaf," Trent Walker said, his voice gaining an edge despite his efforts to stay calm. "I can hear exactly where you're standing. I've been blind since I was 7 years old. This cane is registered with the city. There's an identification tag right here at the handle. You can check it." But Matthew wasn't listening. He was locked into a script that had been playing in his head since the moment he'd seen a black man with something in his hand. In his 11 years of policing, Matthew had never once encountered a situation where his initial assumption had been wrong, at least not in his own mind. Every time someone had tried to tell him he'd misread a situation, he'd doubled down, because admitting he was wrong felt like weakness, and weakness got you killed. The other commuters at the bus stop were starting to react now. Marcus, the hardware store worker, stepped forward with his hands raised in a placating gesture. "Officer, that's Trent Walker. Turner. He works for the city. He's blind. That's just his cane. We see him here every morning." "Step back," Matthew snapped, his free hand coming up in a stop gesture. "This doesn't concern you. Interfering with a police investigation is a crime." "Investigation?" Teresa's voice was sharp with disbelief. "He's waiting for a bus. We're all waiting for the bus. There's no investigation. You can see it's a cane. It's white with a red band. That's what blind people use." But Matthew's mind had already moved past facts and into the realm of perceived disrespect. These people were challenging him. They were undermining his authority in public. That meant they were part of the problem. He could feel his face getting hot, his jaw clenching. The anger that he'd brought with him from the argument with his girlfriend, the frustration from his gambling debts, the accumulated resentments from 11 years of feeling like no one appreciated the dangerous work he did. It was all boiling over, focusing itself on the man standing in front of him with the white cane. "Sir, I'm going to need you to drop that object and place your hands on the bench," Matthew said, moving closer. He could see the cane clearly now, could see the reflective tape, could see that it was obviously a mobility aid. But admitting that now would mean admitting he'd been wrong from the start. And Matthew's entire identity was built on never being wrong. So he kept going, kept escalating, kept telling himself that this was about officer safety, about following procedures, about maintaining control. Trent Walker felt the moment shift. He could hear it in the officer's breathing, in the way his footsteps changed from cautious approach to aggressive advance. He knew what was coming next because he'd heard the stories from other disabled people, from other black people, from the intersection of both identities where the danger multiplied. He knew that compliance didn't guarantee safety, but non-compliance guaranteed violence. "This is my cane," Trent Walker said, his voice shaking now despite his efforts to control it. "I need it to walk. I need it to navigate. If you take it from me, I won't be able to move safely. Please, just look at the identification tag. It has my name on it, my address, my disability registration number. Just look at it." Matthew was close enough now to grab the cane. He could see the tag Trent Walker. "I was talking about a small laminated card attached to the handle with a metal ring, but reading it would require pausing, would require actually listening to what this man was saying, would require acknowledging that maybe, possibly, he'd made a mistake. And Matthew had spent his entire career learning that the moment you hesitated, the moment you second-guessed yourself, that was when things went wrong. So instead of looking at the tag, instead of taking 30 seconds to verify what multiple witnesses were telling him, instead of using even a fraction of the de-escalation training that the department had mandated after his last suspension, Matthew reached out and grabbed the cane. His grip closed around the shaft, just below where Trent Walker's hand rested. He yanked hard, using his full strength, the same aggressive motion he'd used to disarm someone with an actual weapon. Trent Walker felt the cane torn from his grip, felt the sudden loss of connection to the ground beneath his feet, felt the world collapse into the darkness that most people only experienced in nightmares. His hand instinctively reached out, trying to grab the cane back, and Matthew interpreted the movement as resistance. "Don't fight me," Matthew shouted, his voice loud enough to be heard a block away. "Stop resisting." Trent Walker wasn't resisting. He was drowning in sensory darkness, his body's balance system screaming at him that he was about to fall, his spatial awareness completely destroyed by the sudden loss of his primary navigation tool. But Matthew didn't see a blind man in distress. He saw defiance. And defiance, in Matthew's world, required an immediate and overwhelming response. The moment the cane left Trent Walker's hand, the world went from manageable to terrifying. People who can see don't understand what a white cane represents. It's not just a tool. It's not just a safety device. It's the difference between independence and helplessness, between dignity and vulnerability, between being a person moving through the world and being a body trapped in undefined space. For Trent Walker, losing his cane was like losing his eyes all over again. His hand shot out automatically, muscle memory, trying to reclaim what had been taken, trying to re-establish the connection between himself and the ground. His fingers brushed Matthew's uniform sleeve, and the officer's response was immediate and brutal. Matthew grabbed Trent Walker's wrist and twisted it behind his back, applying the same pain compliance technique he'd used hundreds of times before. The pressure sent a shock of agony through Trent Walker's shoulder, forcing him to bend forward, his balance completely gone. "I said stop resisting." Matthew's voice was right in his ear now, breath hot and angry against Trent Walker's cheek. The other hand came up to Trent Walker's sunglasses, fingers hooking under the frame. Trent Walker felt them being ripped away from his face, felt the plastic temple pieces scraping across his skin. And then even the small amount of light and shadow that his damaged eyes could still detect was gone, replaced by the full, absolute darkness that he'd lived with since childhood, but had learned to navigate through sound and touch, and the white cane that was now on the ground somewhere, out of reach. The sunglasses weren't cosmetic. Trent Walker's eyes had been damaged in the accident that had stolen his sight, the corneas scarred and clouded, the pupils permanently dilated. Bright light caused him physical pain, made his eyes water and his head throb. The dark glasses protected him from that pain, but they also served another purpose. They helped other people see him as blind, made his disability visible, prevented exactly the kind of misunderstanding that was happening right now. Without them, his unfocused gaze and damaged eyes would be obvious to anyone who looked, but Matthew wasn't looking. Matthew had already made up his mind. Trent Walker tried to speak, tried to explain, but Matthew was forcing him down onto the bench, hand pressing between his shoulder blades. "I'm placing you under arrest for possession of a weapon and providing false information to a police officer. You have the right to remain silent." The Miranda warning continued, but Trent Walker, I barely heard it. His entire being was consumed by the sensory nightmare unfolding around him. He couldn't see. He couldn't reach his cane. He couldn't orient himself to the space he was in. The bench was hard against his chest, forcing the air from his lungs. Matthew's hand was heavy on his back, pinning him in place. The sounds of traffic and voices and the city morning were coming from all directions at once. No longer the organized symphony that Trent Walker had learned to conduct, but chaos, overwhelming and disorienting. He felt the handcuffs ratchet closed around his wrists, metal biting into skin. His shoulders screamed in protest as Matthew yanked his arms together behind his back, too tight, positioned in a way that sent waves of pain down to his fingertips. Trent Walker's breathing was rapid now, close to hyperventilating. This was what blind people feared most, being rendered completely helpless, stripped of the tools and adaptations that made independence possible, at the mercy of someone who saw their disability as deception. "Please," Trent Walker managed to gasp out, his voice muffled against the bench. "Please, I'm telling the truth. Call the city offices. Check my ID. My name is Trent Walker Turner. I work in urban planning. I'm a disability rights coordinator. Just check. Please just check." But Matthew was already hauling him upright, grip painful on Trent Walker's upper arm. Trent Walker's feet stumbled, trying to find purchase on the ground that he couldn't see, couldn't measure, couldn't predict. He felt gravel under his shoes, then smooth concrete, then he wasn't sure. His spatial map of the bus stop had been completely destroyed. He didn't know which direction he was facing. He didn't know where the curb was, where the street was, whether he was about to step into traffic or into the side of a building. "Walk," Matthew commanded, shoving Trent Walker forward. Trent Walker took a step and his foot caught on something. The curb, a crack in the sidewalk, his own cane lying discarded on the ground. He didn't know. He pitched forward, his hands uselessly cuffed behind him, unable to catch himself. He would have fallen face first onto the pavement if Matthew hadn't jerked him back upright, the motion so rough that Trent Walker's neck snapped backward. "Watch your step," Matthew said, and there was something almost mocking in his tone, as if Trent Walker's inability to navigate was proof of wrongdoing, rather than proof of exactly what he'd been saying all along. The witnesses were shouting now. Trent Walker could hear Marcus's voice, loud and angry, demanding to know what was happening. He could hear Teresa on her phone, her words rapid and urgent. "Yes, I need to report a police officer. He just arrested a blind man for carrying a cane, Riverside and 5th. Please send someone." "This is wrong. This is so wrong." Other voices joined in, a chorus of protest that Matthew ignored completely. He was focused on getting Trent Walker into the patrol car, on completing the arrest, on following through with the narrative he'd constructed in his mind. Backing down now would mean admitting he'd made a mistake, and admitting mistakes was something Matthew had trained himself never to do. Trent Walker felt himself being pushed toward what he assumed was the car. His shins hit something metal, the door frame, the bumper, and he stumbled again. Matthew's hand came down on top of his head, forcing it down with enough pressure that Trent Walker's knees buckled. He was shoved into the back seat, his body folding awkwardly because he couldn't use his hands to guide himself, couldn't see where the seat was, couldn't brace himself against anything. His head cracked against the doorframe on the way in, a sharp pain that made stars explode behind his already sightless eyes. He ended up half lying across the seat, his handcuffed arms trapped beneath him, the plastic upholstery slick against his cheek. The door slammed shut with a heavy thunk that made him flinch. And then he was alone in the darkness, in the silence of the sealed car, with nothing but the sound of his own panicked breathing and the knowledge that everything he'd built, His independence, his dignity, his carefully constructed life had just been stripped away in less than 5 minutes by a man who refused to see him as anything other than a threat. Through the car window, Trent Walker could hear Matthew's muffled voice talking to the witnesses, telling them to back up, threatening them with obstruction charges if they didn't disperse. He could hear the crackle of the police radio, Matthew calling in the arrest, describing Trent Walker as uncooperative and potentially under the influence. Each word was another lie, another brick in the wall that Matthew was building to justify what he'd done. Trent Walker's cane was still on the ground outside. His glasses were somewhere in the grass by the bench, and he was handcuffed in the back of a police car, being transported to a jail cell, charged with crimes he hadn't committed, by an officer who had looked at a blind black man with a federally protected mobility aid and seen only what he wanted to see. A criminal who deserved to be punished. The moment Matthew ripped the cane from Trent Walker's hands, Teresa pulled out her phone. Her fingers were shaking as she opened the camera app and hit record. She'd watched enough viral videos to know how this worked. The police would claim one thing happened, and if there wasn't video evidence to prove otherwise, the official version would become the truth. She wasn't going to let that happen. Not to Trent Walker. Not to a man who'd spent years making Riverside more accessible for people with disabilities, only to have an officer treat his mobility aid like a weapon. "I'm recording this," she announced loudly, making sure her voice would be captured on the audio. "Officer, that's a white cane. He's blind. You can see the identification markings. Multiple witnesses are telling you he's blind. Why are you doing this?" Matthew whipped his head around, his face flushed with anger. "Ma'am, you need to step back. You're interfering with police business." "I'm standing on a public sidewalk documenting a public interaction," Teresa shot back. Her career in the city permits department had taught her exactly how much authority police actually had over citizens who weren't breaking any laws. "I'm not interfering with anything. I'm exercising my First Amendment right to record." Across the bus stop, Marcus already had his phone out too, filming from a different angle. A third commuter, a college student named Jordan who is Trent Walker, had helped navigate the city's student housing bureaucracy last year, capturing the scene from near the street. Within 90 seconds of Matthew grabbing Trent Walker, 3 cameras were running, 3 different perspectives documenting every moment of the encounter. "Officer, please," Marcus called out, his phone steady in his hand. "His name is Trent Walker. Turner. He works for the city in the municipal building downtown. He's been taking this bus for years. We know him. That's his cane. He actually needs it. You're making a mistake." But Matthew wasn't listening. He was too focused on wrestling Trent Walker toward the patrol car, too committed to the version of events he'd already constructed in his mind. What he didn't notice was that nearly every person at the bus stop had their phone out now, that the small crowd of morning commuters had transformed into a gallery of witnesses, each one capturing a different slice of the disaster unfolding in real time. Jordan zoomed in on the cane lying on the ground, making sure the red and white bands were clearly visible in the frame. The white body of the cane practically glowed in the morning light, its purpose unmistakable to anyone who bothered to look. Jordan narrated quietly into the microphone. "That's a standard mobility cane for the blind. You can see the reflective bands. The officer just took it from a blind man and is now arresting him for carrying it." Teresa kept her camera focused on Matthew's face as he shoved Trent Walker toward the car. She wanted to capture his expression, the anger and certainty that seemed to radiate from him, even as multiple people told him he was wrong. She wanted the world to see exactly what was in his eyes when he looked at Trent Walker. Not concern, not caution, but something uglier, something that looked a lot like contempt. When Trent Walker stumbled and nearly fell, when Matthew jerked him back upright with a roughness that made several witnesses gasp, Teresa made sure it was all in frame. When Trent Walker's head hit the doorframe with an audible crack as he was shoved into the car, she captured that too. The sound made her wince behind her phone, but she didn't stop recording. This was evidence. This was accountability. This was the only weapon they had against a system that would otherwise bury this incident under a pile of official reports and qualified immunity. "Did you see that?" Teresa narrated for her video. "The officer just slammed his head into the car. The man is handcuffed and blind. He can't see where he's going, and the officer is treating him like a violent criminal for carrying a cane." After Trent Walker was locked in the patrol car, Matthew turned his attention to the witnesses. His hand rested on his belt near his pepper spray, and his voice took on a threatening edge. "All of you need to disperse. This is an active police scene. If you don't leave immediately, I'll arrest you for obstruction." "We're not obstructing anything," Marcus said firmly. "We're standing on a public sidewalk. We have a right to be here. We have a right to film. You're creating a hostile environment and interfering with my ability to do my job safely," Matthew shot back. It was the kind of catch-all language that officers used when they wanted to shut down recording, vague enough to sound official but meaningless enough to be unenforceable. I'm ordering you to move back at least 50 feet. Nobody moved. The standoff lasted for several long seconds, Matthew's anger visibly building as the witnesses refused to comply with an unlawful order. But eventually, he seemed to calculate that arresting half a dozen people for recording him would create even more problems than he already had. With a final glare at the crowd, he stalked back to his patrol car and climbed into the driver's seat. As the car pulled away from the curb, Trent Walker's cane still lying abandoned on the sidewalk, Teresa stopped her recording and immediately began uploading it to social media. Her fingers flew across the screen as she typed out a caption. Riverside police officer just arrested a blind man for carrying a white cane. This is Trent Walker, Turner, the city's disability rights coordinator. He was waiting for a bus. Multiple witnesses told the officer he was blind. The officer didn't care. This is badge number 5823. This is wrong. Marcus was doing the same thing, his video uploading to multiple platforms simultaneously. Jordan sent theirs to the local news stations, to the ACLU, to every disability rights organization they could find contact information for. Within 5 minutes of the patrol car disappearing down Riverside Avenue, the videos were live on the internet, beginning their viral journey. Teresa picked up Trent Walker's cane from where it had fallen. The graphite fiber was smooth under her fingers, expensive and well-maintained. She could see the identification tag dangling from the handle, exactly as Trent Walker had said. It listed his name, his address, his disability registration number, and an emergency contact. Everything Matthew would have needed to verify Trent Walker's story, if he'd bothered to look. She also found Trent Walker's sunglasses in the grass, one of the lenses cracked from where Matthew had ripped them off. She gathered both items carefully, handling them like the evidence they were. Then she pulled out her phone again and called the number listed on the cane's identification tag. A woman answered on the second ring, her voice warm and unsuspecting. Hello? Hi, is this Trent Walker? Turner's emergency contact? Yes, this is his sister Maya. Who's calling? Teresa took a deep breath. My name is Teresa Rodriguez. I'm a friend of your brother's. I'm calling because he was just arrested by Riverside Police. He's okay, he's not hurt badly, but you need to know what happened. The warmth drained out of Maya's voice, replaced by immediate alarm. What? Arrested for what? Where is he? He was waiting for the bus, like he does every morning, Teresa explained, her words coming fast. A police officer showed up and accused him of carrying a weapon. The weapon was his cane. Trent Walker tried to explain he was blind. We all tried to explain, but the officer wouldn't listen. He took the cane, he took Trent Walker's glasses, and he arrested him. We have it all on video. Multiple angles. I'm going to send you the links. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. When Maya spoke again, her voice was shaking with barely contained fury. They took his cane, they took his glasses, and then they arrested him for being blind. Yes, Teresa said quietly. I'm so sorry, but I want you to know that we're witnesses. We filmed everything. We're not going to let them bury this. Your brother deserves better than this. Thank you, Maya managed to say. Thank you for calling. Thank you for recording. I'm going to call a lawyer. I'm going to get him out. But thank you for being there. After she hung up, Teresa looked at the small crowd of commuters still gathered at the bus stop, all of them looking shaken and angry. We need to make sure these videos don't disappear, she said. Download them. Back them up. Send them to everyone you know. This can't just be another story that gets forgotten. Trent Walker's been fighting for people with disabilities for years. Now it's our turn to fight for him. The patrol car's engine hummed beneath Trent Walker, a steady vibration that did nothing to ground him in the space he couldn't see. He was lying awkwardly across the back seat, his handcuffed wrists trapped beneath his body weight, his shoulder screaming where it was pressed against the hard plastic upholstery. He tried to shift his position, but with his hands bound behind him and no way to see where the seat edge was, every movement threatened to send him sliding onto the floor. The darkness was absolute, not the manageable darkness that Trent Walker had learned to navigate over 21 years of blindness, but a hostile darkness filled with unpredictable motion and unfamiliar sounds. The car was accelerating, turning, braking, and without his cane, without his glasses, without any of the tools he used to build a mental map of his surroundings, Trent Walker had no idea where he was or where he was going. He might as well have been in a sensory deprivation tank, except instead of peaceful silence, there was fear. His breathing was too fast, shallow gasps that weren't bringing enough oxygen to his lungs. Trent Walker recognized the signs of a panic attack forming, the same symptoms he'd experienced in the months after the accident that stole his sight, back when he was 7 years old, and terrified that he'd never be independent again. He'd spent years learning to manage that fear, learning to trust his other senses, learning to believe that blindness didn't mean helplessness. And now, In less than 10 minutes, one police officer had undone all of that work. Through the partition separating the back seat from the front, Trent Walker could hear Matthew talking on his radio. The words came through muffled and distorted, but Trent Walker caught enough to know that Matthew was constructing a narrative that had nothing to do with reality. The suspect was uncooperative and attempted to flee. I had to use physical restraint. Possible narcotics influence given erratic behavior and dilated pupils. Dilated pupils. Trent Walker's eyes were permanently dilated because of the damage from the accident. It was in his medical records, documented by every eye doctor he'd ever seen. But Matthew had looked at them and seen evidence of drug use instead of evidence of disability, because that's what he'd wanted to see. And now that fiction was going into an official police report, creating a permanent record that would follow Trent Walker through the criminal justice system. The car hit a pothole, and Trent Walker's body jerked against the seat. The handcuffs bit into his wrists, drawing a sharp breath of pain. His head throbbed where it had struck the doorframe. His shoulder felt like it was on fire from the way Matthew had twisted his arm. But worse than the physical pain was the psychological trauma of being completely at someone else's mercy, of having no control over his own body or movement, of being unable to predict what would happen next. Trent Walker's mind raced through possibilities, each one darker than the last. What would happen at the police station? Would they keep him handcuffed? Would they put him in a cell? Would they give him his phone call? How would he dial a number without seeing the keypad? How would he navigate the jail without his cane? How would he protect himself from other inmates who might see his blindness as vulnerability? The questions spiraled, feeding the panic that was tightening around his chest like a vice. He tried to focus on his breathing, tried to remember the techniques his therapist had taught him for managing anxiety. 4 counts in, hold for 4, 4 counts out. But it was hard to maintain that rhythm when his face was pressed against plastic that smelled like industrial cleaner and fear, when his shoulders were burning from the angle of the handcuffs, when every turn of the car sent him sliding in unpredictable directions. The worst part was the humiliation. Trent Walker had spent his entire adult life proving that blind people could be independent, capable, successful. He'd earned a master's degree in urban planning. He'd built a career as a city official. He'd become a recognized leader in the disability rights community. He'd given presentations to police departments about how to interact respectfully with people with disabilities. And now he was in the back of a police car, arrested for the crime of being blind in public, his disability treated as evidence of deception rather than a simple fact of his existence. He thought about his sister Maya, about how she'd react when she found out. She'd been his fierce protector since the accident, the one who'd fought with school administrators to get him into mainstream classes, who'd confronted bullies who mocked his white cane, who'd celebrated every milestone of his independence like it was a victory over the world that tried to limit him. This would break her heart, not because Trent Walker had done anything wrong, but because it would confirm her worst fears about how the world saw her brother, not as a person with a disability, but as a disabled person, someone whose humanity was secondary to assumptions about what he could or couldn't do. The car slowed, then stopped. Trent Walker. I heard the driver's door open and close, and heard Matthew's boots on the pavement. For a moment there was silence, and Trent Walker wondered if Matthew was just going to leave him here, locked in the back of a patrol car, with no way to call for help, no way to orient himself, no way to escape. Then the back door opened, and Matthew's hand was on his arm again, pulling him upright. "Watch your head," Matthew said, and this time there was no mocking in his tone, just a flat mechanical quality, as if he was going through the motions of procedure without any real engagement. Trent Walker felt himself being guided out of the car, his feet searching for solid ground. He had no idea what kind of surface he was stepping onto. Concrete, asphalt, gravel. His spatial reasoning was completely destroyed without the feedback from his cane. "Where are we?" Trent Walker asked, hating how small his voice sounded. "Riverside Police Department, Central Booking," Matthew said. "You'll be processed and held until you can see a judge." "I need my phone call," Trent Walker said. "I have a right to contact an attorney." "You'll get your phone call after processing," Matthew replied. "Come on, walk." But walking without a cane, without glasses, in an unfamiliar environment with his hands cuffed behind his back, was nearly impossible. Trent Walker took a tentative step, and his foot caught on something. A curb. A step. He didn't know. Matthew's grip on his arm tightened, keeping him from falling, but the assistance felt more like being dragged than being helped. Every step was guesswork. Every surface change was a potential hazard. Trent Walker had spent 2 decades learning to navigate the world with confidence, and now he was reduced to shuffling forward like a much older man, dependent on the goodwill of an officer who'd already demonstrated he had none. Somewhere in the building ahead, Trent Walker knew there were procedures and protocols, rules about how arrested persons should be treated, requirements for reasonable accommodations for people with disabilities. But he also knew that those protections were only as strong as the willingness of the people enforcing them. And Matthew had already shown exactly how much he cared about Trent Walker's rights. As they moved through Trent Walker, assumed it was a doorway based on the change in acoustics, he made a decision. He would stay calm. He would follow instructions. He would ask for his phone call, and he would call Maya, and she would get him a lawyer, and they would fight this. Not because he expected justice. 28 years of being a black man in America had taught him not to expect that, but because he couldn't let Matthew's version of events become the official record. He couldn't let this become another story of a disabled person, mistreated by police, with no consequences. Another statistic. Another case dismissed as an unfortunate misunderstanding. He would fight. But first, he had to survive the next few hours. Without his cane, without his glasses, without any of the adaptations that made him feel like a person, instead of a burden. And he had to do it while handcuffed, charged with crimes he didn't commit, in a system designed to presume guilt rather than innocence. The door closed behind them with a heavy metallic clang, and Trent Walker felt the last of his hope drain away. Sergeant Patricia Reeves had been working the central booking desk for 12 years, long enough to recognize the rhythm of a normal Tuesday morning. Drunken disorderlies from the night before, a few shoplifters, the occasional domestic violence case. She'd developed a sixth sense for which arrests were legitimate and which ones were going to be problems, usually within the first 30 seconds of an officer walking through the door. So when Brian Matthew walked in with a handcuffed black man who was clearly disoriented and moving like someone who couldn't see where he was going, every alarm bell in Reeves's head started ringing. "What have we got, Matthew?" she asked, not bothering to hide the skepticism in her voice. Matthew had been a problem since the day he joined the department, and Reeves had personally processed at least a dozen of his arrests that later got thrown out for being bullshit. The department kept him on because the union was strong, and Matthew knew how to write reports that technically justified his actions, but everyone from the chief on down knew he was a lawsuit waiting to happen. Adult male, late 20s, Matthew recited, pulling out his notepad. Arrested for possession of a weapon and providing false information to police. The subject was acting suspicious at a bus stop, carrying what appeared to be a metal bludgeon. When confronted, he claimed to be blind and identified the weapon as a mobility cane. Visual inspection showed that the subject's eyes were tracking me, indicating deception. When I attempted to confiscate the weapon for officer safety, the subject became physically resistant. Reeves looked at the man standing next to Matthew, really looked at him. His eyes were unfocused, pupils dilated and clouded with visible scarring. His head was slightly tilted, the way people who rely on hearing often position themselves to maximize audio input. There was a red mark on his forehead where something had struck him, and his wrist showed signs of chafing from handcuffs that had been applied too tightly. He was wearing business casual clothes, slacks, a button-down shirt, a light jacket, not the typical outfit of someone causing trouble at a bus stop. "Where's the weapon?" Reeves asked. "Left at the scene," Matthew said. "Didn't want to transport it in the vehicle with the suspect." That was the first red flag. Standard procedure was to bag and tag any alleged weapon as evidence. Leaving it at the scene suggested that Matthew knew it wasn't actually a weapon and didn't want it examined too closely. "What's your name?" Reeves directed the question to the arrested man, not Matthew. "Trent Walker." "Turner," the man said, and Reeves felt her stomach drop. She knew that name. Everyone in the municipal building knew that name. Trent Walker. Turner was the disability rights coordinator, the one who'd fought to get accessible elevators installed, who'd redesigned the entire ground floor to be wheelchair-friendly, who showed up to city council meetings every month with new proposals to make Riverside more inclusive. She'd met him personally last year when he'd given a presentation about accessible emergency evacuation procedures. "Trent Walker." "Turner who works in urban planning?" Reeves asked carefully. "Yes, Trent Walker," said, a note of desperate hope entering his voice. "I work in the municipal building. I was waiting for the bus on Riverside and 5th. Officer Brian Matthew took my cane and arrested me for carrying it." Reeves turned to Matthew, and her expression could have frozen lava. "You arrested the city's disability rights coordinator for carrying a white cane?" "He said he was blind, but his eyes were tracking me," Matthew insisted. But there was a defensive edge creeping into his voice now. "He was looking right at me when I spoke to him." "Because that's how blind people orient themselves toward sounds," Reeves said, her voice dangerously quiet. "Did you bother to examine the cane? Did you notice the red and white bands that are internationally recognized markings for mobility aids? Did you look at the identification tag that every registered cane is required to carry?" Matthew's silence was answered enough. Reeves looked down at her computer and pulled up Trent Walker's information. It took her less than 15 seconds to find his employment record with the city, his disability registration, and a note in the system that he was a frequent presenter at police training sessions. There were even photos of Matthew himself sitting in one of Trent Walker's training sessions about disability awareness, taken just 8 months ago. "Uncuff him," Reeves ordered. "Sergeant, the arrest was lawful according to—" "I said uncuff him." "Now." Matthew hesitated for just a moment too long, and Reeves stood up from her desk. She was a full head shorter than Matthew, but 20 years in law enforcement had taught her how to project authority that had nothing to do with physical size. Officer Brian Matthew, you have arrested a blind city official for the crime of carrying a federally protected mobility aid. You have ignored multiple witnesses, who identified both the man and the device. You have left alleged evidence at the scene, which suggests you knew it wasn't actually a weapon. And you have caused physical harm to a person with disabilities in the course of an unlawful arrest. If you don't remove those handcuffs right now, I will do it myself, and then I will personally walk your termination paperwork to the chief's office. The booking area had gone completely silent. 2 other officers who'd been processing their own arrests had stopped what they were doing to watch the confrontation. Matthew looked around, perhaps hoping for support, but found none. Slowly, reluctantly, he pulled out his handcuff key and removed the restraints from Trent Walker's wrists. Trent Walker brought his hands forward, rubbing the deep red marks where the metal had bitten into his skin. His shoulders sagged with relief, but his expression remained wary. He'd been through too much in the last hour to trust that this nightmare was actually ending. Reeves came around from behind her desk and approached Trent Walker, carefully, making sure her footsteps were audible so he could track her position. Mr. Turner, I'm Sergeant Reeves. We met last year when you presented to the department about emergency evacuation procedures. I apologize for what's happened to you this morning. This arrest should never have occurred. My cane, Trent Walker said, his voice still shaky. He took my cane and my glasses. I can't navigate without them. I can't get home. I can't go to work. We'll get them back, Reeves promised. Matthew, you're going to return to the bus stop right now and retrieve Mr. Turner's property. Both the cane and the glasses. If you've lost them or damaged them, that's destruction of disability equipment, which is a federal offense. Matthew's face had gone from red to pale. The reality of what he'd done was finally sinking in, now that a superior officer was naming his actions for what they were. Sergeant, I was responding to a call about a suspicious person. I followed procedure 4. You followed no procedure, Reeves cut him off. You made assumptions based on race and disability. You ignored evidence. You dismissed witnesses. And you used excessive force on a nonviolent person who was committing no crime. The only question now is whether this ends with your suspension or with federal charges. Now go get his property before I make that decision for you. Matthew left without another word, and Reeves turned her attention back to Trent Walker. Is there someone I can call for you? Your emergency contact? My sister Maya, Trent Walker said. Her number is on my cane's ID tag, but I can give it to you from memory. He rattled off the number, and Reeves dialed it immediately. While the phone rang, Reeves pulled out an incident report form and began documenting everything Trent Walker told her. The false arrest, the excessive force, the confiscation of disability equipment, the witnesses who tried to intervene. Every detail went into the official record, the one that Matthew would have to answer for. When Maya answered, Reeves identified herself and quickly explained the situation. She could hear the fury in Maya's response even through the phone, but she could also hear the relief when Reeves assured her that Trent Walker was safe and the arrest was being voided. He's going to need a lawyer, Maya said. This can't just disappear into an internal review. My brother was traumatized. He was physically hurt, and this officer needs to face real consequences. I agree completely, Reeves said, and I'll make sure my report reflects everything that happened. But right now, your brother needs to get home safely. Are you able to come pick him up? I'm already in my car, Maya said. I'll be there in 15 minutes. After the call ended, Reeves guided Trent Walker to a chair and brought him a bottle of water. I know this was terrifying, she said quietly. I know it shouldn't have happened. I'm going to do everything in my power to make sure Officer Brian Matthew is held accountable. Trent Walker took a long drink of water, his hands still trembling. How many times has he done this before? He asked. How many other people has he hurt who didn't have jobs with the city, who didn't have witnesses with cameras, who didn't have someone like you who recognized their name? It was the question Reeves had been asking herself for years. Too many, she admitted, and that's going to change. Starting today. By the time Matthew returned to the police station with Trent Walker's cane and glasses, the videos from the bus stop had already been viewed over 200,000 times. Teresa's upload had been shared by a local disability rights group, which had tagged several national organizations, which had retweeted it to their combined following of 3 million people. Marcus's video had been picked up by a citizen journalism account that specialized in police accountability, and their analysis thread had gone viral. Jordan's footage had been sent directly to every major news outlet in the state. The Riverside Police Department's public information officer's phone started ringing at 9:47 a.m. and didn't stop. Local news wanted a statement. National news wanted interviews. Disability advocacy groups wanted an explanation. Civil rights attorneys were already calling, offering to represent Trent Walker. Pro bono. And on social media, the hashtag Justice for Trent Walker was trending in 3 states. Chief of Police Margaret Daniels watched the first video in her office with her door closed and her head in her hands. She'd been warning the city council for 2 years that Matthew was going to cause a major incident, that his pattern of excessive force and his history of complaints were building towards something catastrophic. They'd ignored her warnings because firing Matthew meant fighting the union, and fighting the union meant political headaches that no one wanted to deal with. Now the headache had arrived anyway, except instead of a union grievance, they were looking at a federal civil rights lawsuit and a public relations nightmare. She called Sergeant Reeves first. "Tell me it's not as bad as it looks on video." "It's worse," Reeves said bluntly. Matthew arrested a blind city official for carrying a white cane. Multiple witnesses told him he was making a mistake. He ignored them. He used unnecessary force. He caused physical injury. And he left the so-called weapon at the scene because he knew it wasn't actually a weapon. "There's no way to spin this, Chief. It's exactly what it looks like." Daniels closed her eyes. "Where's Matthew now?" "Returned the victim's property and is currently in the parking lot checking his phone." "I assume he's seeing the same videos we're all seeing." Matthew was indeed seeing the videos, and with each one he scrolled through, his sense of impending doom grew. The comment sections were brutal. People were posting his badge number, calling for his termination, digging up his history of complaints, and posting screenshots of the internal investigations. Someone had already created a petition demanding his firing, and it had 10,000 signatures in the first hour. His phone started buzzing with texts from other officers, some expressing disbelief, others distancing themselves from him with careful language that made it clear they'd never really been friends anyway. The union representative called to say they'd provide legal support, but that Matthew should probably avoid talking to anyone, especially the media. And then his captain called to tell him to report to the chief's office immediately. The walk from the parking lot to Daniels' office felt like a death march. Matthew could feel eyes on him from every officer he passed, could hear the whispers that stopped abruptly when he got close enough to make out words. By the time he knocked on the chief's door, his hands were sweating and his heart was racing. "Sit down," Daniels said, her voice cold. She didn't offer any of the usual pleasantries, didn't ask how he was doing. She just pulled up the videos on her computer and turned the screen so Matthew could see. They watched in silence. Matthew saw himself on camera, saw the white cane clearly visible in the frame, saw the witnesses trying to intervene, saw himself ripping the cane away and manhandling Trent Walker into the patrol car. From the outside, watching it like this, even he could see how bad it looked, how indefensible it was. "That's Trent Walker, Turner," Daniels said when the video ended. "He presented to this department 8 months ago about disability awareness. You were in that training. I have the attendance sheet with your signature on it." Matthew felt his stomach drop. He did remember that training, vaguely. A guy talking about how to recognize mobility aids, how to interact respectfully with people with disabilities. Matthew had been on his phone for most of it, barely paying attention, because he'd already decided that the training was just politically correct nonsense that had nothing to do with real police work. "I didn't remember," he started to say. "You didn't remember because you didn't care," Daniels interrupted. "You saw a black man with something in his hand, and you made assumptions. And now those assumptions are going to cost this department millions of dollars and what's left of our community trust." "I was responding to a call," Matthew said weakly. "The dispatcher said a suspicious male, possibly armed. And 8 witnesses told you he was blind and carrying a cane. You chose not to listen. You chose to escalate. You chose to use force. Those were choices, Matthew, and now you get to live with the consequences." Daniels opened a folder on her desk and pulled out a document. "You're suspended without pay, effective immediately. Your badge and weapon need to be turned in before you leave this building. There will be a formal investigation, and I can tell you right now how it's going to end. You're done. Your career in law enforcement is over." Matthew's mouth went dry. "Chief, I've given 11 years to this department. And in those 11 years you've racked up 17 complaints, 3 suspensions, and 6 reassignments. We've bent over backward, trying to reform you, trying to give you second chances, and you've repaid that patience by arresting a blind man for being blind." Daniel stood up, signaling that the conversation was over. "Badge and gun. Now." Matthew's hands shook as he removed his badge from his uniform and placed it on the desk. The gun followed, heavy and final. Without them, he felt naked, stripped of the identity he'd built his entire adult life around. He'd been Officer Brian Matthew. For 11 years, he didn't know how to be anything else. "The union will be in touch about representation," Daniel said. "But I want you to understand something. This isn't just an internal disciplinary matter. The city attorney is expecting a federal civil rights lawsuit. The DA is reviewing the case for criminal charges under the Americans with Disabilities Act. And even if you somehow avoid prison, you're going to spend the rest of your life paying for what you did this morning. Matthew left the chief's office in a daze. He walked past the booking desk where Sergeant Reeves was still documenting the incident, past the bullpen, where other officers studiously avoided making eye contact, past the photos on the wall of officers who'd received commendations and medals. His photo wasn't among them. It never would be. Outside, the parking lot was filled with news vans. Reporters were setting up cameras, practicing their stand-ups about the viral video of a Riverside police officer arresting a blind man. Matthew kept his head down and walked quickly to his personal car, but one reporter spotted him and started shouting questions. "Officer Brian Matthew, do you have any comment on the arrest of Trent Walker? Turner, do you stand by your actions? What do you say to people calling for criminal charges?" Matthew didn't answer. He got in his car and drove away, knowing that his life as he'd known it was over. The videos would follow him forever. Future employers would Google his name and find the story. His family would see the footage and wonder how he could have done something so obviously wrong. And somewhere out there, Trent Walker, Turner was going home to heal from the trauma that Matthew had inflicted on him, for no reason other than assumptions and ego. By the end of the day, the videos had been viewed over 5 million times. The petition calling for Matthew's firing had 40,000 signatures. 3 law firms had reached out to Trent Walker, offering representation, and the Riverside Police Department had issued a formal apology, acknowledging that the arrest should never have occurred. But no apology could undo what had been done. No statement could erase the fear of Trent Walker had felt in that patrol car, or the humiliation of being treated like a criminal in front of his community, or the violation of having his independence stripped away. The videos had made Matthew's fall from grace public and permanent. But for Trent Walker, the real question was whether justice would follow the publicity, or whether this would become just another viral moment that changed nothing. 14 months after his arrest, Trent Walker, Turner sat in a federal courtroom listening to Officer Brian Matthews' attorney try to convince a jury that his client had acted reasonably. The attorney's strategy was clear. Paint Matthew as a cautious officer responding to a legitimate call, a dedicated public servant making split-second decisions in a dangerous situation. He emphasized the anonymous 911 call, reporting a suspicious male. He showed photos of the cane from angles that made it look like it could be a weapon if you squinted and ignored the red and white bands. He suggested that Trent Walker's aggressive body language had forced Matthew to escalate. It was a performance designed to create doubt, but it crumbled the moment Trent Walker's attorney, a fierce disability rights lawyer named Sarah Chen, started showing the videos. The jury watched in silence as the footage played on the courtroom's large screens. They watched Matthew approach with his hand on his weapon, aggression already loaded in his posture. They watched Trent Walker calmly explain that he was blind, lifting the cane to show its identification markings. They watched multiple witnesses trying to intervene, their voices clear on the audio. "That's his cane. He's blind. We know him. You're making a mistake." They watched Matthew ignore all of it. They watched him rip the cane from Trent Walker's hands, snatch away his protective glasses, and manhandle a disoriented blind man into a patrol car. And they watched Trent Walker's head strike the doorframe with a sickening crack that made several jurors visibly wince. Chen let the videos speak for themselves, then brought in witnesses. Teresa Rodriguez testified about watching Trent Walker every morning at the bus stop, about how he used his cane to navigate, about how obvious it was that he needed it. Marcus described trying to reason with Matthew, trying to explain who Trent Walker was and what the cane was for, and being threatened with arrest for his trouble. Sergeant Reeves testified about Matthew's history of complaints, about how she'd recognized Trent Walker immediately, about how Matthew had left the weapon at the scene because he knew it wasn't actually a weapon. Then Chen called Trent Walker to the stand. He testified about the training he'd given to the Riverside Police Department 8 months before his arrest, training that Matthew had attended. He described the terror of being in the patrol car without his cane, the sensory deprivation, the helplessness. He explained that in 21 years of being blind, he'd never felt as vulnerable and dehumanized as he had in those 10 minutes with Officer Brian Matthew. "I've spent my career trying to make the world more accessible for people with disabilities," Trent Walker said, his voice steady despite the emotion underlying it. "I've given presentations to police departments about how to recognize and respect mobility aids. I've fought for laws protecting disabled people from exactly this kind of discrimination. And then I became a statistic in the very problem I've been trying to solve." Chen also brought in expert witnesses. A disability rights advocate testified about the legal protections for mobility aids under the Americans with Disabilities Act, explaining that treating a white cane as a weapon was a federal civil rights violation. A psychologist testified about the trauma of sensory deprivation for blind individuals, the lasting psychological harm that Trent Walker had suffered. A former police chief testified that Matthew's actions violated every standard of reasonable force and proper procedure. Matthew's attorney tried to counter with character witnesses, officers who described Matthew as dedicated and hard-working. But Chen demolished them on cross-examination, bringing up Matthew's 17 complaints, his 3 previous suspensions, the pattern of excessive force that the department had documented but never seriously addressed. The character witnesses couldn't explain why a dedicated officer had ignored multiple people telling him he was making a mistake. They couldn't explain why proper procedure included leaving alleged evidence at a crime scene. The trial lasted 6 days. The jury deliberated for 4 hours. When they returned, the forewoman's voice was clear and firm as she read the verdict. In the matter of Turner versus Matthew, on the charge of violation of the Americans with Disabilities Act, we find for the plaintiff. On the charge of excessive force, we find for the plaintiff. On the charge of false arrest, we find for the plaintiff. The damages came next. Compensatory damages for Trent Walker's medical bills, for his therapy costs, for the work he'd missed while recovering from the trauma, $200,000. Pain and suffering damages, $800,000. And then the big number, the one that made headlines, punitive damages designed to punish Matthew's egregious conduct and deter similar behavior in the future, $6 million. Total judgment, $7 million. The courtroom erupted. Matthew's face went white. His attorney was already shaking his head, preparing appeals arguments that everyone knew wouldn't change anything. The videos were too clear. The violations were too obvious. The jury had sent a message, and that message was that you couldn't treat disabled people like criminals just for existing in public spaces. Outside the courthouse, Chen held a press conference with Trent Walker. At her side, "This verdict is about accountability," she said. "It's about recognizing that disability rights are civil rights, and violations of those rights have real consequences." Officer Brian Matthew saw a black man with a disability aid and made assumptions based on prejudice rather than observation. The jury has said unequivocally that this is unacceptable. Reporters shouted questions. How will Officer Brian Matthew pay the judgment? What does this mean for the Riverside Police Department? Trent Walker, how do you feel about the verdict? Trent Walker leaned toward the microphone, his hand resting on the same white cane that had been the center of the case. "I feel like justice was served," he said. "But I also feel sad that it took a federal lawsuit to get here. There are countless disabled people who've experienced similar discrimination and didn't have witnesses with cameras, didn't have jobs that made them recognizable, and didn't have the resources to fight back. This verdict is for them too. It's a statement that our lives have value, that our mobility aids are not weapons, and that we deserve to move through the world with dignity and safety." The practical reality of the $7 million judgment became clear in the months that followed. Matthew had no assets that came anywhere close to that amount. His house was mortgaged, his savings depleted from legal fees. The court ordered his wages garnished at the maximum legal percentage, which meant that for the rest of his working life, a significant portion of every paycheck would go directly to Trent Walker. Matthew's law enforcement career was over. No department would hire him after the federal civil rights conviction. He ended up working in a warehouse, loading trucks for $12 an hour, watching his paycheck get carved up before he ever saw it. His lifestyle collapsed. His girlfriend left. He moved into a studio apartment in a bad part of town. And every month, when he saw the garnishment line on his pay stub, he was reminded of the 10 minutes that had cost him everything. But Trent Walker didn't spend much time thinking about Matthew's punishment. He put the judgment money into a foundation dedicated to training police departments on disability awareness and funding legal aid for disabled people who experience discrimination. He continued his work as Riverside's disability rights coordinator with renewed determination. And he used his story as a teaching tool, speaking at conferences and police academies and city councils about what happens when assumptions override evidence. A year after the verdict, Trent Walker stood in front of a room full of police recruits at the State Training Academy, his white cane resting against the podium. The recruits had all watched the videos as part of their training. They'd studied the case as an example of what not to do. "The officer who arrested me didn't wake up that morning planning to violate someone's civil rights," Trent Walker told them. He woke up with biases and assumptions that he'd never examined, with training that emphasized threats over humanity, with a department culture that had enabled his behavior for years. When he saw me at that bus stop, he didn't see a person. He saw categories: black, male, carrying something. And he reacted to those categories instead of looking at the actual evidence in front of him. Trent Walker tapped his cane against the floor, the sound sharp in the quiet room. "This is not a weapon. It's a tool that helps me navigate the world independently. The red and white bands on it are internationally recognized symbols. The identification tag lists my name and registration number. Any officer who took 30 seconds to look would have known exactly what it was. But looking would have required pausing, questioning initial assumptions, and treating me like a human being worthy of basic respect. And that officer wasn't trained to do any of those things. The recruits listened with the kind of attention that comes from seeing what happens when training fails. They asked questions about how to identify different types of mobility aids, how to approach someone with a disability, how to de-escalate when there's confusion about what's happening. Trent Walker answered each one patiently, knowing that this was where real change happened. Not in courtrooms or headlines, but in the moment before a traffic stop, in the second before someone decides to reach for their weapon, in the choice between seeing a threat and seeing a person. The $7 million judgment got attention, Trent Walker concluded. But money doesn't undo trauma. What I want from each of you is simpler. Look before you act. Question your assumptions. Treat the people you encounter as individuals, not stereotypes. And remember that the tools disabled people use to navigate the world are not crimes. They're accommodations that allow us to live independent, dignified lives. As the recruits filed out of the room, several stopped to shake Trent Walker's hand and thank him for sharing his story. One young officer, barely out of her teens, said quietly, "I'm sorry that happened to you." "It shouldn't have." "No, it shouldn't have," Trent Walker agreed. "But it did, and now we get to decide what we learn from it." The case became precedent, cited in other disability rights lawsuits across the country. Police departments updated their training materials, adding sections on mobility aids and disability awareness. And while Trent Walker knew that one verdict wouldn't end discrimination against disabled people, he also knew it was a step forward. Officer Brian Matthew would spend decades paying off the judgment, a financial burden that would follow him for the rest of his life. But for Trent Walker, the real victory wasn't Matthew's punishment. It was the conversation his case had started, the awareness it had raised, and the possibility that the next blind person waiting at a bus stop wouldn't have to fear that their cane would be mistaken for a weapon. Justice, Trent Walker had learned, wasn't just about punishing wrongdoing. It was about changing the systems that allowed wrongdoing to happen in the first place. The $7 million was a price tag on Officer Brian Matthews' misconduct. But the real cost, and the real value, was measured in the lives that might be protected because someone had finally been held accountable. This case proves that accountability is possible when ordinary people refuse to look away, when they pull out their phones and record, when they speak up, even when threatened with arrest. Teresa, Marcus, Jordan, those witnesses changed everything. Their videos turned what could have been another buried complaint into a landmark civil rights case. If this story moved you, if it made you angry, if it made you believe that change is possible, then do 3 things right now. First, hit that like button so this story reaches more people. Second, subscribe to this channel because we're committed to bringing you stories of injustice and accountability that mainstream media often ignores. And third, drop a comment telling us what you think about this case. Do you think $7 million was enough? Should Matthew face criminal charges? What needs to change in police training? Your voice matters, and we read every single comment. Most importantly, remember Elijah's message to those police recruits. Look before you act, question your assumptions, and treat people as individuals, not stereotypes. Because the person you're looking at might not be a threat. They might just be someone trying to catch a bus. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one. Stay vigilant, stay informed, and never stop demanding accountability.